This is not what the world needs, and if Christians were reduced to offering the world only this humanism, they would soon be set aside, and rightly so. Since there have always been socialists, teachers of morality, and organizers of society, they have rendered service, but they have never saved anyone. The world today does not need greater social organization, but a Savior. Man today needs someone who will answer the fundamental problems of his existence, which no social structure has ever been able to do. Vatican II agreed with Danilo and issued a decree on the church's missionary activity, which affirmed that missionary activity is concerned with the task of preaching the gospel and planting the church among peoples or groups who do not yet believe in Christ. Not everyone saw the mission of the church in terms of eternal salvation. After the merger of the International Missionary Council with the World Council of Churches in 1961, the voice for social needs became dominant in Protestant circles. In 1968 report of the Council asserted, "We must see achievements of greater justice, freedom, and dignity as a part of the restoration of true manhood in Christ." This calls for more open and humble partnership with all who work for these goals, even when they do not share the same assumptions as ourselves. Evangelical Protestants inside and outside the World Council offered still response to the humanistic turn to Protestant missions. Many felt the Council was abandoning the true goals of evangelization and asked the Council to reverse its stand. Another problem in world evangelization was the crisis in culture or contextualization. Culture is more than books, opera, and social registers. Culture is in missionary circles stands for a man's life in the world, the corporate ideas and emotions that influence him, his links with the past, and his expressions of reality in his material creations. The problem of culture arises when we think of Christianity's role in the world. The church claims a supernatural origin, but it cannot escape human history. It is to be a thing apart from the life in the world. Should it reject the traditions and customs of people and create new ones? Or should the church adopt completely the life of the people? What if a nation's art and customs are linked with religious beliefs opposing the Christian faith? Mission leaders are divided on the answers to these questions. Some fear compromises of the true faith and take an exclusive approach. Others argue that Christianity can never take root in Africa or Asia until it finds nourishment in the soil of Africa or Asia. This means non-Western culture. Another problem surrounds the other world religions. The revolution the West brought to the values and lifestyle of others throughout the world has been overwhelming. To cope with this, many are turning to religion, but not mainly westernized Christianity. They are turning to either a resurgent ancient religion or to a native version of Christianity, sometimes strongly nationalistic and tolerant of ancient ideas and customs that take into account aspects of human life that the Western church left out. For example, oil-rich nations in the Middle East are making possible revival in Islam. On the other hand, religious practice based on African tradition is receiving attention, modernization, and public recognition. Its apostles claim that in time it will supersede both Islam and Christianity, which are considered foreign in Africa. These rejuvenated religions give rise to the question for Christians concerning how Christianity relates to other world faiths. It is the exclusive approach to the answer. For example, is Islam totally false and therefore hostile to Christian advance? Or is the inclusive approach of the true Christian answer? Is Islam a preparatory faith, a kind of schoolmaster to bring the third world to full faith in Christ? The third world church is faced by problems that reflect its beginnings in a missionary movement captive to the West. The impressive growth provides a bright picture, yet there are dark shadows that must be faced realistically. Break time. Young Ralph Reed spent a summer's internship in the halls of the U.S. Senate and learned that he loved politics. Upon his return to school at the University of Georgia, 1972, he knew that he had a mission to mobilize the campus conservatives in the same way that liberals had been in the 60s. Reed understood that his lifestyle was a problem, especially heavy drinking. He vowed to himself that he would give up alcohol once and for all in a thirst for deeper spiritual meaning in the life swept over him. He searched the yellow pages and randomly picked out a church to attend. In a matter of days, he became a born-again charismatic Christian. Evangelical confession and restoration soon followed. He wrote to one victim of his previously dirty politics, "I was the cause of all the unsavory behavior. Politics for me had degenerated into a cheap play for power. I now realize that politics is a noble calling to serve God and my fellow man, he wrote. Reed's political and organizational skills made the Christian Coalition, founded by Pat Robertson, the most effective political force in the family values movement. Time magazine reported in 1993, with a resume that includes a doctorate in American history as well as many innings of political hardball, Reed, at 32, has made himself a model for the latest incarnation of the religious right. The question, what does a genuine Christian do about the moral decline of society, came to the forefront. Personal choice and individual rights had come to dominate American popular culture. Children were raised to be expressive individuals and to demand their rights. Americans had come to feel that success was a rich life, experience, and strong feelings. Freedom was the freedom to be oneself against society's constraints and traditions. In the 1970s and 80s, the traditional image of noble Americans being self-reliant, take-charge individuals who must on occasion resist authorities in order to do what is right and good was transformed into the liberated, expressive individual. Let it all hang out became the new watchword. Happiness was promoted as a life rich in experiences, strong sensual feelings, and self-expression. Since the real self was a morally indefinable entity, most considered its discovery an unending search. The view of reality centered on self strongly impacted Protestant and Catholic churches in America. Privileged Protestants, mainline churches, were negatively impacted because they were perceived as symbols of the old ways, established by an irrelevant past. Officials tended to endorse the optimistic view of the human self, but they also appealed to the federal government as the guarantor of the inalienable rights of the expressive self. They became noticeably unempathetic about the God of our fathers who cast our lot in this free land. As a result, membership and finances declined during the 1980s and 90s, suggesting that these churches were moving from the main line to the sideline. In sharp contrast, conservative Protestants, including evangelical fundamentalists, charismatics, and Pentecostal groups, were flourishing. These churches also reflected the age of self, yet they retained their faith in the life above and preached it. Growth occurred in many of the smaller evangelical denominations, and phenomenal growth took place in independent, non-denominational megachurches. The Assemblies of God quadrupled from 500,000 to more than 4 million. By 1990, Roman Catholicism had jumped to 55 million. These large numbers directly relate to the explosive growth of the U.S. Hispanic population. Fully one-third of the Roman Catholic Church in America is now Hispanic. Catholic leadership took a new center position, presenting a social vision to its members as well as society. The most striking feature of religious life during the age of self was the growing number of Americans who designated themselves as having no religious preference. In 1980, 61 million Americans claimed no church affiliation. By the 90s, 78 million gave that answer. Millions more were believers, but not belongers. They considered themselves spiritually inclined and interested in spiritual things, but did not affiliate with any organized religious group. This spreading secular mind created problems for the evangelism and growth of American churches. In the early 90s, millions came up with their own recipes for moral commitment in a cultural supermarket. Without denominational brand name loyalty, they tended to pick up most anything from the God shelf that seemed to offer a quick fix. Changes in the American family seemed to feed this trend. Families in America tended toward the non-traditional with a variety of values, career and gender roles, and liberal views towards living together outside of marriage. Single-parent families reached 1 in 5. Working women made up at least 40% of the workforce. And a highly individualistic and privatized religious culture tested the ingenuity, patience, and staffing abilities of most churches in the 90s. Confusion among clergy was also evident. Only one-third of pastors said that they felt their efforts in ministry produced spiritual results in the lives of their members. Clergy stress, illness, and burnout were rampant. Together, these signs indicated the old-time religion was moving swiftly to a minority status within the American culture. A host of ideas and events contributed to the new way of looking at reality, but two developments stand out: the popular acceptance of psychology and the pervasive use of television. The new way Americans look at their inner world began after World War II. Millions of young servicemen had direct contact with psychology for the first time. Many received psychiatric treatment and discovered the magic of therapy. An article in Life magazine published in 1947 stated, "From the horde of outright psychotics who occupy more than half of all the hospital beds in the country to the simple-minded folk who seek guidance and solace from the phony tea leaf psychiatrist in Los Angeles and elsewhere, the story is the same, a mass demand for psychiatric help which has swamped facilities and practitioners alike." Paperwork novels in Hollywood added to the interest in mental illness. Television appeared in the 50s as a cool medium for communicating human emotions and appealing to the inner world of self. As early as 1955, social critic Philip Reif stated that the symbolic center of America's cultural landscape was no longer the church building or the legislative hall, but the hospital. In the late 60s, it was fashionable and healthy to hang loose, be free, and experience inner space. It was unhealthy to have hang-ups or to be uptight. Immoral acts were explained by psychological conditions. During the years of the baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 64, the ethic of self-denial, including concepts of duty, postponed gratification, and self-restraint, which earlier Americans considered virtues, were no longer advertised or considered valuable. Only rights and opportunities were valued. By stressing the liberation of the self, expressive Americans came to treat every commitment, from marriage and work to politics and religion, not as moral obligations, but as mere instruments of personal happiness. Sexuality seemed to fill a particularly critical function in the individual's quest for self-expression and self-realization. It seemed to be the primary source of the ultimate significance of the soul. Liberation of sexuality from social control became a pervasive social cause. Boundaries and the security they provided were gone. The changes in American attitudes, including the tolerance of those who sought fulfillment of their sexual drives outside of marriage, including homosexuality, are evident. The new therapeutic ethic promoted honest self-expression and communal intimacy. Clinics, agencies, and therapy centers created a new growth industry. Traditional self-restraint, governed by the standards of religious institutions, was no longer healthy. It reflected hypocrisy or enslaving conformity. People needed to be freed from their past. Joshua Meyerowitz revealed the fundamental ways that television had impacted American social behavior, including life in the churches. In his study, No Sense of Place, the impact of media on social behavior. By revealing previously backstage areas to audiences, television has led to a decline in the image and prestige of political leaders. It has demystified adults for children and demystified men and women for each other. This has led to the widespread rejection of traditional child and adult, male and female, leader and follower roles. Television has fostered the rise of hundreds of minorities or peoples who began to see themselves unfairly isolated in the world. It played an important part in social explosions, which began in the 60s. The many liberation movements of blacks, women, elderly, children, disabled, and homosexuals. The rise of malpractice suits, the development of halfway houses for prisoners and the mentally ill, the decline of the nuclear family, the trends toward living alone and living together. Electronic media bypassed traditional channels and gatekeepers and undermined the pyramids of status that were once supported by a print culture. Parents, teachers, doctors, corporation presidents, political leaders, and experts of all kinds began losing the controlling elements that supported their traditional status. Television fed the demand that all information, whatever its source or form, be accessible to the average person. Leaders in business, politics, and religion were forced to espouse a public commitment to openness in order to appear trustworthy. Ironically, the more people found out about what their leaders did and knew, the less they accepted them as authorities. Once authorities in society gave away their information, the more the status dissolved. The consumer became king. The rise of the expressive individual and the therapeutic mind set America against America. Two parties, liberalist and traditionalist, struggled for the nation's soul. This struggle was the most obvious sign that Americans no longer shared the same vision of the good society, the same idea of patriotism, the same code of morality, or the same religious faith. The rise of the expressive individual and the therapeutic mind set America against American against American. Two parties, liberalist and traditionalist. I'm reading the same thing again. Let's see. Both parties looked at the same country but saw different things. The last quarter of the 20th century saw the easing of divorce laws, legislation of abortion, the ending of censorship, and a new tolerance for alternative lifestyles. America's academic, artistic, and media elite, often called the new class, saw these events as great advances for human freedom and dignity. The other half of the nation saw moral decadence, social degeneration, and national decline. Traditionalists argued it is the truth that sets men and women free, the truth handed down in pseudo-Christian traditions, beliefs, and books. These values provide the foundation of true morality, which should in turn serve as the bedrock of the legitimate laws in a good society. After all, that is what America is supposed to be. America's laws were more and more rooted in a new secular morality that held that men and women may create their own moral code, that all voluntary sexual activity is moral, neutral, and legally permissible, that abortion is a woman's right, that pornography, like beauty, is only in the eye of the beholder, that suicide and euthanasia are logical, legitimate, and humane, and that if a man wishes to distort his mind with drugs, that is his business alone. As in the past, Christians responded to the cultural shift in one of two ways. Some chose to resist the changes. Others decided to adapt to the changes. Resistance came through political action led by the religious right movement. The label stood for a loose coalition of fundamentalists, Pentecostal, evangelical, and Catholic Christians who were driven by concern for the decline in the American morality and who became extremely active in the political arena. The passion of the religious right lay in their perception that the United States was falling under the influence of secular humanism, and traditional family values were under attack in the media and public schools. To counter the agenda of the cultural left, the religious right preached, promoted, and marched against abortion, the Equal Rights Amendment, homosexuality, pornography, and the increased government involvement in education and welfare. The issues of abortion, homosexual rights, and feminism served to mobilize conservative Christians for battles in the political arena and soon expanded to exclude other moral and political issues. These Christians found a political home in the Republican Party, which historically advocated a limited role for the federal government. To achieve their goals, the religious right relied heavily upon the ministries of the televangelists who promoted the conservative, moral, political agenda. These groups succeeded in educating and mobilizing fundamentalists and Pentecostals, a segment of American population that had once been politically inactive. After President George Bush's election in 1989, Reed had the Christian coalition pursuing a more combative strategy. It tried to take over the GOP committees, ousting complacent regulars indifferent to the coalition's Bible-based agenda. Liberal opponents, like People for the American Way, fed off of the image of the religious right as a sinister, rigid, and exclusionary movement. Reed aimed to make peace in mainstream Republicans while continuing the movement's war with secular liberals. Not all Christians joined the resistance to the cultural shift in America. Many preferred to think that self-expression could be enlisted for gospel duty. Many Protestant Catholic churches presented themselves to the public as healing or happy communities. The word itself became part of the therapeutic and multimedia industry. Churches experimented with the tokens of mass-produced affection, the illusions of community, bumper sticker smiles, personalized form letters, televised compassion, and published advice. Expressive individuals within the churches threatened to overthrow corporate Christianity. User-friendly churches like America's prevailing culture made religion almost totally a matter of personal choice. Confession, covenant, vows, ministerial authority, tradition, community, all became little more than memories of the past. In 1980, a Gallup poll found that 80% of Americans held that an individual should arrive at his own religious beliefs independent of any churches or synagogues. As a result, Americans in the 80s and 90s chose churches not so much to meet God and surrender to His revealed ways as to satisfy some personal need. Church attenders rarely asked, "What must I do?" They were more likely to ask, "What do I get out of this?" Churches became less doctrinal and more emotional and sentimental. Like families in the age of self, they were expected to be havens of love and acceptance in an otherwise harsh and competitive society. With the decline of denominations in American public life and the increasing privatization of religion, large churches gained an increasing share of church-going America, the religious market. These churches grew in part because they shed the negative image of denominational Christianity and appealed to popular religious taste. Megachurches like to think of themselves as independent and highly individualized, with attenders in the thousands. Sunday morning services were usually full-service assemblies. Their buildings were filled the rest of the week with Bible classes, support groups, field trips for senior citizens, weight loss classes, and children's activities. The appeal to popular taste was seen in several common characteristics. First, these congregations seldom carried a denominational label. Their name typically was a symbol of their openness to people with diverse backgrounds and problems: divorce, addictions, and depression. Second, the worship was marked by fast-paced and enthusiastic popular religious music. Third, they were built around the attractive ministry of a magnetic preacher. Sermons stressed the Bible's application to day-to-day life. Loyalty was usually to the pastor rather than denomination or congregation. Fourth, these large churches seemed to have the best that money could buy. Buildings were often new, staff ministers were well-trained and effective, and services were available for every imaginable need. Historians tend to view this development as another example of Americans' privatization of faith. Attenders of megachurches were looking for faith that served the private life, help on child rearing, family unit, and personal emotions. American society sought a private house, a private means of transportation, a private garden, a private laundry, a private service for stores, and self-service stores. Even within families, Americans had come to expect that each member of the family have a separate room, even a separate television, phone, and car, when economically possible. In this world of private choices, Americans have been slow to discover how many people are desperately lonely. Sociologist Philip Slater wrote in his book, The Pursuit of Loneliness, "We seek more and more privacy and feel more and more alienated and lonely when we get it. We compete rather than cooperate. We avoid rather than engage. We play it cool and thereby make the world a little colder." The global village. In November 1989, the impossible happened. The Berlin Wall was reduced to rubble and the Cold War was over. Russians began to refer to their Marxist past as 74 years on the road to nowhere. Within the traditionally atheistic society, churches were suddenly allowed to present the gospel on television. New laws were drafted reversing the oppressive practices of decades, and Christians were enlisted to provide much-needed social services in new nations. Russia turned its back on an official position of atheism and to become what many considered the most open mission field in the world. This revolution in Russia highlighted the Christian story during the last quarter of the 20th century. The term often used to describe the post-Cold War conditions was globalization. The century that began with World War I ended with political leaders talking about a new world order. But in most circles, globalization was a convenient term to summarize recent cultural, political, and religious changes that occurred around the globe. The peoples of the earth were discovering each other. The widespread perception that the world had become a global village was created in part by new technology with power to communicate news and vital information instantaneously. The dismantling of the Berlin Wall contributed to the feeling of one world because television cameras carried it to homes all around the world in a matter of seconds. This event served to invite people everywhere to look at the world with new hope. CNN moved swiftly in the 1980s from an American television channel to a window on the world. A series of international free trade agreements became further evidence that old walls isolating nations from other nations were falling. These agreements were based on production sharing, which simply means that by 1990, a product could be manufactured in stages and distributed across more than one country. This sharing of production emerged because labor markets had changed significantly. Newly developed countries built plants, giving work to the country's emerging labor force and the opportunity to manufacture exported products. This change in labor markets proved to be a major part of the globalization of markets. Production sharing radically changed the traditional concept of trade as an exchange of goods and services across national borders. Globalization presented Christian churches and missions both an opportunity and a challenge. At the end of the 20th century, Christians were aware that millions of people around the world believed differently than they did. Religion had become politicized, and politics religionized around the world. Globalization and opportunity. The former Soviet Union is the best political example of a new opportunity opening for Christian witness. When Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Empire, he announced restructuring and openness as policies to revive the economy. These steps led to the collapse of communist ideology in all of Eastern Europe. When Gorbachev said that he would no longer use Soviet forces to support those regimes any longer, in August of 1991, the communist system collapsed where it had begun, and in December the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. Soviet leaders reversed the whole machinery of government and moved toward the return of Christianity to the peoples of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev sent a letter in October of 1991 inviting a group of American evangelical Christian leaders to Moscow to advise the government. The letter appealed for help in rebuilding the moral values of Christianity in the former communist empire. The 19 evangelicals who responded called themselves Project Christian Bridge. It was clear the new leaders looked upon Christian churches as the only hope for their demoralized citizens. Schoolrooms were open to Christian teachers from the United States and Canada. Campus Crusade for Christ evangelists were soon showing their Jesus film in Russian schools. Bibles were once again printed and distributed, as well as Bible study lessons on Christian values for children. The Orthodox Church was clearly represented in public events, and airtime was given for Orthodox preaching on Russian television. With the signs that the world was shrinking came to a new consciousness of the religious and cultural diversities of the people. Ethnic and religious conflicts around the world filled the evening news. While communism's ideology lived on only in China and Cuba, another powerful totalitarian ideology reasserted itself in North Africa and the Middle East. It was called the Islamic fundamentalism. Shiite Muslims gained political power in 1979 by overthrowing the government of the Shah and proclaiming an Islamic republic in Iran. The new government, led by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Musa Khomeini, became one of the most brutal and oppressive in the modern world. Its success in gaining power led Islamic fundamentalists in nearby nations to aim at similar goals. In every country with a large Muslim population, Islamic fundamentalism became part of the political scene, and governments were forced to make concessions in order to remain in power. The rise of these militant Muslims led to the use of the term fundamentalism in a wider and wider circles. Almost everywhere that religious passion fueled strife among ethnic parties, the international press spoke of the offending parties as fundamentalist. There were Muslim fundamentalists in Iraq and Jewish fundamentalists in Israel, as well as traditional fundamentalists in the United States, where the term had been used to designate conservative Protestants resistant to cultural change. In almost every case, the religious fundamentalist, emphasizing the strong bonds between religion and politics, raised fresh questions about the proper relations of church and state. Christian ministers and missionaries came to realize how militant Islam could be with its highly developed systems of philosophy, law, and ways of doing things. If Christian leaders hoped to confront this pluralistic world with integrity, they faced an enormous new challenge to define justice in a meaningful way and to explain the gospel with a tender voice. In the same quarter century, the United States and Canada were experiencing their own surging tide of cultural diversity. World events and massive immigrations from Latin America and Asia made multicultural experiences almost a daily reality. Repercussions were most obvious in big cities where the workforce was predominantly black, Hispanic, and Asian. In some, no racial group could claim majority status. In 3 short decades, everyone had become a minority. At the same time, the century-long trend that took people off the farm and into the city was turning around because personal computers linked home-based people to city offices. Urban high-tech sophisticates were moving to rural areas, forcing new thinking about the whole meaning of the Christian church. As a result, churches built on homogeneous groups who lived close together were facing a variety of peoples with ethnic social backgrounds. Classifying people by denominational backgrounds was rapidly becoming a thing of the past. Secularization proved to be both a historic process and a personal point of view. The separating of church of state, the secularizing of church ministries, and the liberating of educational institutions from church authority are examples of the historic process. Culture and its symbols also affected thought patterns. There are now an increasing number around the globe who look upon the world and their own lives without the benefit of any religious view of life at all. The obvious expression of this secular mindset is in a new attitude toward religious pluralism. Contemporary Americans are confronted with a wide